How's it going, guys? I'm Mike Dwyer from the Bunker Recordings and BetterMixes.com, and today I've got another cool plugin to show you. So I just got this recently, but I've absolutely fallen in love with it. Anybody who records live drums should at least check this plugin out. And I think it's especially useful for home studio guys who aren't always working with the most well-recorded drums in the world. So this is it. It is called Oxford Drumgate by Sonnox. I know what you're thinking, really? Another drum gate? And that's exactly what I thought too, but as soon as I tried it, I realized, for my workflow at least, this was going to save me a ton of steps and therefore a ton of time. So let's take a look at our kick-in mic, and we'll set this back to default. And let's hear our track without the drum gate first. So that has a ton of bleed going on, mostly from the absurd amount of compression we are doing. But I really dig the sound of the compression, so I want to make that work and get rid of a lot of that bleed. So let's turn this on. So right off the bat, it sounds like a gate. It's working, cool. So over here we have our threshold, which is more or less the same as on any old gate. So we're just going to set that so all of our kicks are going above the threshold. So that's working pretty well here. But let's just imagine for a minute that the bleed was even worse, or there were some really quiet kick hits mixed in there as well. So let's bring this way down for a minute. Okay, so now our snare is opening our gate as well, and all we have to do to fix that is click this kick button here. So you can see, just by clicking that, now the gate will not open for any of those snare hits, even though they're above the threshold. So like I said, in this case, that wasn't super necessary because there was enough of a difference between our kicks and the bleed. I'll show you an example in a minute that really shows how well that works. So the next thing that makes this gate really cool is the decay section over here. So if I flatten this out real quick, this slider here is just going to work like the release knob on a standard gate. And just like a standard gate, that isn't working so great. If we have the decay time really tight here, we're cutting out all that nasty bleed in the cymbals, but our drum sounds super choked. And then if we lengthen it, the drum itself sounds better, but we're getting a lot of that cymbal bleed in there. If you watch my video on gating toms, you might know where I'm going with this, but this has this handy little feature here where you can adjust the decay time for different parts of the frequency spectrum. So in this case, let's set our gate pretty tight, something like that for now. We'll tweak that in a minute. Then we're going to bring this up, which is going to lengthen the decay time of just the area in between these two nodes, in this case 40 to 400. And we'll bring that 40 all the way down to 20 since we're working with a kick drum and there's a lot of low-end information. And let's just tweak that a little bit. So something like that sounding really good to me. So we're letting that low end of the kick bloom, but just letting a tiny bit of that high end attack through before cutting out the cymbals. Real quick, let's just compare this. I'll bring this all the way back down so it's acting like a normal gate, and then bring it back up again. So you can see just how much more life that gives to the drum by just raising this up a little bit. We'll touch on these sliders in a minute when we look at our snare, but the final section here is the leveler. So basically, you can use this section to level out the dynamics of an inconsistent performance. Obviously, sometimes you want to keep all the dynamics there. It's all a matter of taste and genre and all of that. But there are times you might just want to even it out. Maybe the drummer was hitting inconsistently in an unintentional way, or like I said, just for certain genres, you want it super, super consistent. So we're just going to bring this slider down a little bit so our kicks are all above it. Then we can set our target level. In this case, the default looks fine. You can see all of our hits are kind of floating right near that line. And then we can just dial in the amount of leveling we want. Just so you know, this isn't compression. This is looking at each individual hit and turning that whole kick hit either up or down to get closer to our target level. So it doesn't affect the shape of the drum in the same way as a compressor. I personally like to use this before a compressor, so my drums are hitting the compressor more consistently. So let's just dial this up a bit and see what we can do. So this drummer is already really consistent, but for this genre, I like just a little bit more consistency there. So let's take a look at another instance of this on snare drum. So you can see here we have snare selected, And like I said, this can be an absolute lifesaver. If you've ever gotten tracks where the hi-hat bleed is literally as loud as the snare drum itself, you know how difficult it can be to gate that. And this does a really, really good job solving that problem. So again, let's just set this to default and dial this in real quick. So again, you can see the snare selection doing its job there. At the very end of that loop, there was a little fill there, and it looked like one of the toms peaked above our threshold, but it still didn't open the gate. So now going over to our decay section, we'll do something very similar to last time. We'll just do this real quick. Something like that sounding pretty good. But I'm having a little bit of a problem. This sounds really good on the hard hits on the snare, but the light ghost notes are letting in too much cymbal bleed for me. Here, listen to that real quick. So what we can do is this shorten decay slider here. If we crank that up, it's going to analyze each hit and actually adjust the release time based on how hard the hit is. So the softer hits are going to have a much faster decay. Let's check that out. That's sounding a lot better to me. Still might sound a little bit jarring on those ghost notes, but I think in context it'll be fine. And if not, we have our gain reduction slider here. So it defaults to -40, but we can bring that up if we don't want to gate it that hard. So if we do something like that, it'll be a little more subtle. But in this case, just for the heck of it, let's just crank it down all the way and go with that. And then we're going to take a look at the leveler again, because there's one really, really cool feature that we didn't really touch on the kick. So first off, it does have this auto set feature, which is pretty cool. So let's let the plugin figure out the settings, and then we'll just tweak them. Cool. So it looks like it did a pretty good job. So this split slider here, we want to set that in between our hard hits and our ghost notes, so that all our ghost notes are underneath and all of our hard hits are above. Now we can set separate targets for these. The loud one looks like it's pretty good where it put it. The soft one, I want to have a little bit lower, maybe down like this. And then we can do some fairly aggressive leveling on the hard hits and just a little bit on the soft ones to even out those ghost notes. Let's check that out. So let's take a look at another interesting use. So here we have our overhead track. So let's say we want to bring out the snare a little bit in that. So if we open up drum gate here, you can see we have snare selected. And even though the cymbals and the toms and everything are just as loud as the snare in the overhead, just by selecting snare there, it's going to totally ignore everything else and only open for the snare. Now in our decay tab, we've set the gain reduction to about 7 decibels, and then we used our trim here to boost the output by that same 7 decibels. So basically what this is doing is just boosting the snare by about 7 decibels in our overhead mics. So let's turn off the compressor that's coming after that and hear the difference real quick. Here's before and after. So now what we can do is when we throw our compressor on, we can compress the snare drum pretty hard in the overheads to get that big full sound without compressing the cymbals too much. Because overcompressing your overheads can sometimes make the cymbals really harsh. And just to show you how well this detection circuit works here, let's throw an instance of drum gate on our drum bus, and we'll mute our parallel drum bus here. So let's set this back to default and see what we get. So just as you'd expect, the gate is opening for kind of everything and it sounds really, really bad. Let's select snare here and see what we get. So just like that, we've been able to isolate our snare drum in a drum loop basically. Now obviously you never actually use it like that. What you could do here is just reduce it by, I don't know, let's say 4 or 5 decibels. And then just like on our overheads, we'll boost the trim up by the same amount roughly. and now we were able to turn our snare up by 5 decibels in essentially a drum loop. That's pretty crazy. If you're working with drum loops, this could be a great tool for manipulating them to get the sound you want out of them when you don't have access to all the individual tracks. But anyway, let's turn that off, and then real quick, let's just do a before and after of all of these drum gates. Here's without them. And now with. Pretty huge difference. So if you want to learn more about this plugin, I'll put a link to the company's website in the description down below. And if you found this video helpful, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. And head on over to bettermixes.com to grab a free copy of my Ultimate EQ cheat sheet.